The Amazing Spider-Man is a television series that originally aired on the CBS network from 1977 to 1979. The series stars Nicholas Hammond as Peter Parker and his crime-fighting alter ego, Spider-Man. Before Hammond, the only other live-action interpretation came from Spider-Man's educational appearances on the children's television series The Electric Company. The shorts from the fourth season of The Electric Company, starting in the year 1974, featured Danny Seagren as the old webhead and were called Spidey Super Stories. Eventually, a spin-off comic book series of the same name was produced by Marvel Comics to tie into the television shorts. Although Spidey never appeared as Peter Parker and only spoke by way of pop-up balloons that the kiddies at home had to read, this did not stop the infansanity of one Alex Ross to insist that Spider-Man have no dialogue in the miniseries Marvels.
Buddy, you're in my seat!
Even though Hammond is credited as both Peter Parker as well as Spider-Man, many of the action scenes feature stuntman Fred Waugh. For instance, it was Waugh who swings between buildings or on top of the roof of an automobile. He even scaled the Empire State Building and almost collided with a building when dangling from a helicopter.
What is he like physically?
Physically? Well, I suppose you could say we're kind of similar types.
The made-for-television version certainly comes with some minor tweaks and differences from the source material. Spider-Man mostly wall crawls on the series and would only occasionally web-swing from time to time. When he did, it was more like the game Pitfall than any fluid, continuous form of web-swinging as it is presented in the comics or previous cartoon series. Spider Tracers were a completely electronic creation and in no way related or connected to Spider-Man's SpiderSense as they were in the comics. Rather than using his SpiderSense to home in on the tiny, spider-shaped tracking devices, on the television series, Spidey would use what is essentially a spider tracer radar that would serve as a homing beacon. Spider-Man usually only resorted to his spider tracer in the comics when the bug planted went way out of the range of his regular spider senses.
If a man somehow gained the powers of a spider...
How could he do that?
That's the part of the puzzle I haven't figured out yet. But if he did have the powers of a spider, he would be magnificent. He would have incredible strength. He could leap 20, 30 feet in the air. He would have a highly developed sixth sense.
You mean a sense of danger?
Exactly.
He could spin a web?
Even though the dialogue would seem to indicate a fairly good understanding of Spider-Man's powers, I find the actual depictions of his abilities are all very troubling. No one who wrote this show really understands how SpiderSense works. It's not so much a crystal ball making predictions, as it is the internal alarm of his nervous system that works in tandem with his incredible reflexes. On the series, he may get a randomly placed warning of danger from time to time, but his superb agility is often never addressed.
Julie, wait!
SpiderSense is often used or not used at the writer's convenience. They will often utilize the power as a tool to service a mediocre script. However, if it becomes an inconvenience because the script or budget requires a lone thug with a handgun to shoot Spider-Man, they will not hesitate to abandon any advance warning of danger. Spider-Man is shot multiple times over the course of the series, and true blue fans are left wondering why he didn't just dodge the bullet.
Game over, man. It's game over.
Spider-Man shouldn't be getting shot by a single dude with a handgun. Furthermore, what is the point of having SpiderSense warn you of danger if you choose to write the character walking directly into it? Lame! Also, there are other moments of inconsistency on the show in relation to his spider strength. He often uses his 10-ton level spider strength on the show, for instance, to free a driver who is trapped behind the wheel in a car accident, bending prison bars, or breaking open vault doors, yet he can't break out of standard ropes tied behind his back without a buzzsaw? Lame! Moreover, Spider-Man's webbing itself looks more like standard rope and is often even treated as such despite its toughness and strength strength is presented in the pages of the comic books or other media. For example, he covers these Foot Clan wannabes in a web net, and not 2 seconds later, they have escaped from the webbing. Most fans know that it takes about an hour for Spider-Man's webbing to dissolve.
That's correct, young man.
It's Parker. Peter Parker.
Weren't you in one of my classes at the university?
Yes, sir. Zoology 422.
Now I remember.
What is this, a family reunion here?
Escape from webbing is not the only bothersome issue in regard to the portrayal of the substance's strength. Later, these same martial artists actually burn away his web line. Over the years, Spider-Man has refined his chemical formula for web fluid, adding flame-retardant capabilities to the mix. If the webbing can stand up to guys like the Molten Man and the Human Torch, I think it should be able to hold its own against these guys.
Oh, well, he'd be delighted to hear you say that, Captain. Do you mind if the Bugle quotes you on that?
Not on your life. I'm not giving any recognition to some freak who runs around in a red and blue Union suit.
Now, I'm not saying the webbing is indestructible or anything, but it's usually fairly durable unless it's snapped apart by the super strength of Dr. Octopus's arms or the 100-ton strength of the Incredible Hulk. Keep in mind, this is the same webbing that gives guys like the Blob paws and can even hold the weight of cars aloft in the air. So when normal human beings like the Punisher can supposedly cut through Spider-Man's webbing with a knife, it's simply silly writing or poor editing in my opinion.
Bogus.
Then, of course, I guess you weren't a superhero on television in the 70s if you didn't go through the great and awesome rite of passage that is fighting with a giant grizzly bear. Or a dude in a gorilla costume. Of course, Spidey one-ups them all by goofily using his web line to be a lion tamer. Next, Spidey has all these stupid allergies and sneezes quite frequently in the pilot. It's not like his eyeglasses in other media where he starts out with poor eyesight before the spider bite, and then after the body chemistry changes, those conditions inevitably go away. No, the sneezing doesn't even go away after he gets spider powers, and even ends up giving him away on the job as a superhero.
For fuck's sake.
Another thing is that the recycling of the Spider-Man action footage, while a cost-saving measure, doesn't always make a whole lot of sense. The first time Spidey is thrown off a building, he shoots out a web net to stop his descent, which makes perfect sense. Nobody wants to see a spider pancake. However, when that sequence is later reused, Spidey is doing some kind of tightrope balancing act and walking in between two buildings. I don't get it. Why would he even do that when he could just leap across the buildings or just web swing from one building to another?
You have failed me for the last time, Admiral.
In a similar fashion to the new costume Ben Reilly wore, with his web shooters placed on the outside, in the sensational Spider-Man comics starting in the year 1996, the television series Spidey wore his sole web shooter and utility belt on the exterior of his costume as well.
Would you believe me if I called and said I was Spider-Man?
You got a point.
All this criticism isn't to suggest that there aren't characters which would indeed be familiar to the readers of the Amazing Spider-Man comic books that would make appearances on the show. One example being Peter's kind and elderly aunt, May Parker, who's played by Jean Marie Donnell in the pilot episode. After the pilot episode, Donnell would be recast as Aunt May by Irene Tedrow. Interestingly enough, she even mentions an uncle of Peter's. However, it isn't the uncle you might be expecting.
You look just like Errol Flynn, very dashing.
You made these?
Oh, no, I found it in the attic. Your Uncle Max bought it for a Halloween party. I just cleaned it up a bit.
So, while Peter's origin of getting bitten by a radioactive spider from a lab experiment is preserved, this is practically confirmation that Peter never received the life lesson that came from his uncle's early demise, or that his Uncle Max even died.
Remember, with great comes great
Peter essentially begins his journey as a graduate student and part-time photographer, putting himself through college before he ever becomes Spider-Man. Conversely, in the comics, he would start out as a high school student and come to work for the Daily Bugle after he begins his superhero career as Spider-Man. However, eventually, by Amazing Spider-Man 185 in the year 1979, Peter Parker would become a graduate student of the fictional Empire State University. Empire State University first appears by the year 1965 in the pages of Amazing Spider-Man issue number 31. Intended to be an amalgamation of New York and Columbia University, many well-known Marvel characters have attended or are alumni, such as Reed Richards of the Fantastic Four and even his arch-nemesis, Doctor Doom.
I am expelling you from the university.
Expelling me?
Get out of here!
There's nothing more your stupid school can teach me anyhow.
Now, if you could get me a picture of the Spider-Man, that I'd buy.
Who?
Parker, you have a job with this paper as a part-time photographer because it's always been my policy to help students who are working their way through college. Thanks to you, I am seriously considering changing that policy.
J. Jonah Jameson, publisher of the Daily Bugle, is portrayed by David White in the initial pilot episode. Later episodes see Robert F. Simon in the role of the stern and gruff Daily Bugle publisher for the remainder of the series' run. While he's not Spidey's biggest fan or anything, JJ doesn't appear to have the full hate-on for Spider-Man that he does in the comics. He definitely comes across as a principled and caring father figure underneath all the hemming and hawing.
Hey, wait a minute, what are you doing?
Oh, listen, everything will be fine. Our dad's right behind us, and he'll take care of everything.
Come back here! She said you'd take care of everything. You are their father, aren't you?
Their father?
Parker!
Joseph Robbie Robertson, who is played by Hilly Hicks, is also only featured in the pilot episode. Robertson serves as Jonah's editor-in-chief and would first appear inside the pages of the Amazing Spider-Man issue number 51 by the year 1967, but isn't actually called by name until the following issue. Subsequent appearances of the character on television can be seen in Spider-Man the Animated Series and The Spectacular Spider-Man. Robertson also appeared in the Sam Raimi directed Spider-Man series and is portrayed in all three films by actor Bill Nunn. One of the first issues of The Spectacular Spider-Man I ever bought was issue 139 by Rita Conway and Sal Buscema, where Tombstone breaks Robbie's back. Robbie's story has always stuck with me ever since then.
Oh, come on, JJ, this is a biggie!
Despite Robbie only appearing in the pilot episode, J. Jonah Jameson's sassy gal Friday, Rita Conway, portrayed by Chip Fields, becomes a regular cast member following the pilot. Rita is technically JJ's secretary, but also is Peter Parker's best friend and steadfast supporter at the Daily Bugle. She's always in his corner when JJ's on a tear or Peter needs a tricky favor.
The motor pool has to have a requisition.
Well, doesn't he have to sign it?
Hasn't he?
Rita, you're a terrific artist.
I ought to be. Got my PhD from the University of the Streets.
While there is no Rita Conway in the comics, I think we can just chalk this up to Hollywood's fear of Stan Lee's penchant for alliterative names that is continued by Jerry Conway when he introduces Glory Grant by the year 1975 inside the pages of Amazing Spider-Man issue 140. Glory takes notice of her new neighbor, Peter, as she is an aspiring model and he is a photographer for the Daily Bugle. However, the modeling biz ends up taking a downward turn for Glory and she decides to get a 9-to-5 gig. So, Peter ends up helping her secure a position as J. Jonah Jameson's secretary by the year 1977 within the pages of Peter Parker, The Spectacular Spider-Man issue number 2. I don't really think there's any question that the character of Rita Conway on the television series is really just Glory Grant with a non-alliterative name.
What do you think?
Gotcha. Game's up, Parker. We know who you really are.
Glory Grant would also go on to appear in the 90s Spider-Man animated series voiced by Nell Carter, as well as the Spectacular Spider-Man television series, where the character is transposed as one of Peter Parker's friends at Midtown High School instead of a neighbor and co-worker.
Hi, Miss Grant.
Peter, you can't go in there.
Captain Barbera is Peter Parker's New York Police Department contact throughout the first season of the show. Barbera is played to great effect by Michael Pataki. While a friend to the youthful Peter Parker, the Captain is usually on the hunt for Spider-Man in the beginning of the series, even though they eventually help one another out on occasion.
What do you want me to do about this Spider-Man?
Oh, I'm getting reinforcements for him.
Good.
Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And if we're lucky, maybe Rumpelstiltskin will lend us a hand. What am I going to do about Spider-Man? How do I know? I'm a cop, not an exterminator.
I'm a doctor, not a bricklayer.
He's one hell of a character, but even with his comical tone at points, he does also bring to mind the more tragic police contacts from the comics like George Stacy or Jean DeWolf, who also held the rank of captain. Although the Barbera character has vanished by the second season, Pataki would go on to provide the voice of the Sewer King in Batman the Animated Series. Previous to Batman the Animated Series or Spider-Man, he served as one of King Tut's henchmen known as Amenephis Tewfik, though you may remember him better as the Klingon Korax from the fan-favorite episode The Trouble with Tribbles.
Laddie, don't you think you should rephrase that?
You're right. I should. I didn't mean to say that the Enterprise should be hauling garbage. I meant to say that it should be hauled away as garbage.
The producers end up removing the Barbera character from the regular cast lineup by the second season of the show. A variety of actors filled in as lieutenant detectives from the NYPD that would serve as Peter's new contacts, but you sort of get the idea that these scenes could have still have been done with Pataki.
Lieutenant Murphy, come on. Everything is connected to the airport. On top of that,
Peter, the airport is out of my jurisdiction.
The new addition to the regular cast lineup as of Season 2 is Ellen Bry as Julie Masters. Masters is pretty much Peter's rival, annoying tag-along little sister, and ultimately a possible love interest rolled all up into one. Personally, I can't stand her.
Julie, why don't you do us all a big favor and go away?
It'd be like if they took Lance Bannon, who was also a rival photographer of Peter Parker's from the comics, and then mashed him up with his jealous fiancée, Amy Powell. Powell, in her infinite wisdom, tries to make time with Pete in order to make Lance jealous. Lance Bannon first appears within the pages of The Amazing Spider-Man issue 208 by the year 1980. Sadly, by the year 1994, in Web of Spider-Man issue 114, Lance would be killed off by this ridiculously designed 90s villain named Facade.
Don't be a fool. Go away.
Initially, Pete, even as Spider-Man, is just as annoyed with Little Miss Tagalong as we are, but magically, somewhere along the way, they go from rival photographers to holding hands in the park, dating, and finally, romantic prison visits.
Yeah, well, I'm not too crazy about it myself.
You may be questioning why Peter Parker would even be sent to prison. In the second season episode, Photo Finish, he's locked up for withholding false photographic evidence planted in his camera. Actually, come to think of it, Peter Parker ends up going to prison quite a bit. He's placed in jail in the Spider-Man the Animated Series episode titled Framed, and is also forced to break out of prison in a similar fashion inside the pages of Amazing Spider-Man issue 401 by the year 1996.
It won't be that bad, Peter.
Another item of particular interest is that the pilot episode ends up being released overseas as a feature-length film called Spider-Man. The pilot was okay, but honestly nothing special either. It's just the little things, really. Peter Parker wouldn't be wearing a short-sleeved shirt if he's got his Spider-Man costume underneath, and just ends up saving the day by sheer luck. Pete is hypnotized like all the other lemmings, and if it wasn't for the Empire State Building's railings knocking off the control lapel attached to his jacket, the case would have ended in complete and utter failure. I much prefer the next episode, The Deadly Dust, which was also released overseas as the feature-length film titled Spider-Man Strikes Back. First off, the best thing about this two-part episode is the casting of the stunning Joanna Cameron as Gail Hoffman. I honestly have no idea why they didn't just make her character the series regular instead of stupid Julie Masters. Even Captain Barbera would agree with me on that.
Parker, you weren't in your apartment last night.
No, I wasn't. I spent the night here.
That's right.
On the couch, Captain.
Gail Hoffman is the reporter that gets paired up with Peter Parker because her paper wants to land the first exclusive interview with Spider-Man. Some of the conversations the two have about Spider-Man are a pretty clever way to convey how Peter actually feels about being Spider-Man without necessarily giving himself away to his attractive colleague.
Nobody asked him to save the world.
I don't really think he wanted any part of being a superhero.
Then all he has to do is turn in his little blue tights.
And what about his conscience? What is the point of having some kind of special power if you don't use it to help people?
Okay, it could be a tough life.
And lonely. How can he ever talk to people the way we're talking right now? I mean, what kind of a life can he really have? Think about it for a minute. He has to lie to everybody. At work, to his friends. What about girlfriends? How could he ever hope to get married? People think it would be really wonderful to have Spider-Man's powers. Let me tell you, I'm not so sure whether it's a blessing or a curse.
I doubt if he could have put that much better. You know, Parker, there's more to you than I thought.
Next, most of the story is actually set in Los Angeles, so they don't have to try and use California's shooting locations and then fail to pass them off as somewhere in New York City.
You've got as much chance of going to California at my expense as you have of walking upside down on that ceiling.
Additionally, while there really weren't any authentic supervillains from the Spider-Man comics themselves, the arms dealer, Mr. White, is eccentric enough in his manner and dress that I could have seen him as a reoccurring villain much in the vein of the Kingpin or Silvermane.
Relax, Lamone. If I have my way, we'll be meeting Spider-Man again.
Unfortunately, neither Gail Hoffman nor Mr. White returned to the series, and though the episode has its share of goofy moments, it certainly is one of the better ones.
Very nice.
Even though it's not the greatest episode, I would feel remiss if I didn't bring up the Season 1 episode Night of the Clones, when Dr. Moon is spurned yet again for the prestigious Torvald Award in the sciences. His evil clone takes retribution for his better half. Moon is played by Lloyd Bachner, whose voice you may recognize as Mayor Hamilton Hill from the acclaimed Batman the Animated Series.
I don't know what you're talking about.
And I'm going to make sure that you don't leave this room. You can't lie to me because you can't lie to yourself.
Oh, right.
Seeing the two clones of Dr. Moon interact reminds me very much of the Kingsley brothers. Roderick Kingsley, of course, is the villainous Spider-Man character called the Hobgoblin, who uses his twin brother Daniel as an alibi for his criminal activities. The Hobgoblin's modus operandi is akin to the clone of Dr. Moon using the original Moon as an alibi for his own foul play.
You did this. We both did it.
In the episode, Spider-Man himself is cloned and battles his own evil clone. You can't help but to be reminded of the now infamous Spider-Man clone saga, which was a long-running story in the 1990s resulting in evil versions of Spider-Man such as Kane and Spider-Side. However, the story was actually plucked from a previous storyline from the 1970s that culminated in the face-off between the clone and the original in the pages of Amazing Spider-Man issue 149, just as in the climax of the television episode Night of the Clones.
That's right, Peter. I'm you, and you're me, and this is a gun.
That voice! He sounds like me! Oh, how I despise you! And for that reason, you must be obliterated. You see, I really hate clones.
To conclude on a positive note, the final two-part episode, The Chinese Web, is another episode that I rather enjoyed. When an old friend of J. Jonah Jameson's named Min Lo is targeted for assassination, Peter and Min Lo's daughter, Emily, must put aside their differences and work together to clear her father's name. You may recognize Emily as she is portrayed by Rosalind Chow, who prior to Spider-Man appeared briefly as Dr. Carolyn Field's receptionist in the Incredible Hulk episode titled Married, and is most familiar to fans of Star Trek as Keiko O'Brien, Deep Space Nine's resident schoolmarm. Even though she winds up as Chief O'Brien's nag of a wife, I have to say she's actually really pretty in this two-parter. The Lows initially come to America for discreet help from Jonah and the Bugle. However, pretty soon, Peter Parker becomes involved as his last write-up in the Bugle made Sam Malone from Cheers look good. After multiple assassination attempts, Min Lo finally has that final fatal heart attack that they keep promising Aunt May will have. Emily is, of course, really pissed off at Peter because while he may have ducked out to change into Spider-Man, all she knows is that he ran away like a little punk. Here we get some nice insight into Peter's head.
Emily, it's only because I have to prevent anyone from knowing that I'm Spider-Man that I ran away.
You're a coward. You left us to be killed.
If only I could tell you.
I never want to see you again.
I didn't know you had a bad heart, Mr. Min. If I had known, I wouldn't have run away. I swear I wouldn't have run away.
Eventually, Peter finds a former Marine, now history professor, who will go with the two to Hong Kong to testify on Min Lo's behalf. Again, a plus is that the episodes here are actually shot on location in the city of Hong Kong and aren't just Los Angeles locations dressed up as New York City. While Spider-Man fights on the Lo's behalf, he is wounded and pulled out of the local harbor by fishermen. Emily then rushes to his aid, and when they take Spidey back to a private doctor, he is finally unmasked in front of Emily, who quickly changes her previous opinion of Peter's character.
Emily?
Oh, Peter. Thank goodness you're all right. I feel like such a fool calling you a coward like I did. I didn't realize you were Spider-Man.
Spidey often ends up being unmasked in these television episodes, like in the episode Photo Finish, which has more of a Norman Osborn vibe to it, but the great payoff in The Chinese Web is a lot sweeter and reminds me more of Mary Jane and Peter's interactions at the end of Spider-Man 2.
Hi.
Hi.
Spider-Man Peter Parker. Mr. Parker goes to the head of the list.
The two-part episode was also released overseas as the feature-length film titled Spider-Man: The Dragon's Challenge. Starting in the pages of Amazing Spider-Man issue 184, a similarly Eastern-themed villain was featured called the White Dragon. From that issue until Amazing Spider-Man 190, the comic billed Spider-Man as Marvel's TV sensation.
Will you ever come back to Hong Kong?
Well, I have a reason to now.
The Chinese Web was the final episode of the Amazing Spider-Man television series. According to an interview with Nicholas Hammond from Science Fiction magazine, there was an attempt made in 1984 by Bill Bixby to revive both The Incredible Hulk and The Amazing Spider-Man in a crossover adventure. This was not only to have Hammond reprise his role as Spider-Man, but also Bixby's and Lou Ferrigno's return as both David Banner and The Incredible Hulk. Hammond seemed quite enthusiastic about his contributions to the upcoming project and the plan for him to wear the current black costume. Sadly, this project never came to pass because Lou Ferrigno was in Italy filming Hercules films at the time.
Hey, Peter, wait!
Oh, not now. I'm sorry. I can't wait.
Great! Listen, we did have a date. I was supposed to meet you here.
Oh, yeah, that's right. I apologize. Something big has just come up. I'll have to make it up to you later.
As far as my closing thoughts on The Amazing Spider-Man, sadly, I tend to share comic creator Stan Lee's ultimate disappointment in the material.
The Spider-Man TV series I was very unhappy with because very often people will take a novel, let's say, and bring it to the screen. They do a movie adaptation, and they will leave out the one element, the one quality that made the novel a bestseller. Or they do that with television. with Spider-Man, I felt that the people who did the live-action series left out the very elements that made the comic book popular. They left out the humor. They left out the human interest and playing up the personality and characterizations and personal problems. On a technical level, I think they did a good job. I mean, the scenes of him climbing on the walls, and in those days, they didn't have the wherewithal that they have today, and they did a very good job of that. But to me, it was just a one-dimensional show.
Though I've mentioned this before, it's fairly easy for me to see that this was mostly shot in downtown Los Angeles, and a key ingredient that is missing from the series is that New York vibe that Spider-Man desperately needs. A bit of stock footage, establishing shots, or a few location shoots in New York City just don't cut it. Things like the pilot attempt to address things like the old Parker luck, where things just don't go Peter's way, or even the humor that Stan Lee felt was notoriously absent from the television series, but Spidey really doesn't get much of a chance to be funny at all. To be honest, most of the jokes or one-liners come from J. Jonah Jameson and Captain Barbera. In fact, the only genuine joke I can remember Spidey being involved in was really a setup by Barbera, with Spidey as almost the straight man.
Thanks, that'd have been a Barbera sandwich if I hadn't pulled out the bologna. Hey!
The pilot even attempts to address that Peter Parker has had his share of financial problems, but as the series continues, it pretty much becomes a moot non-issue. He never really talks about his grad student bills, or web fluid bills, or really any bills at all after the first pilot episode.
Well, would you settle for a poverty-stricken grad student?
Nicholas Hammond makes a pretty good Peter Parker. We're exposed to his scientific and brilliant mind, and see the character grow from his beginnings as a freelance photographer to a full-fledged reporter throughout the course of the series. The writers do a good job of establishing Parker's prominence as a grad student who is getting his PhD in physics. This is also useful for his superhero career as Peter invents the web shooters, web fluid, spider tracers, and the homing radar. We even see Spider-Man cutting into things like closed-circuit television to stop a criminal insurance scam, and how as Peter, he's always at the top of his class when it comes to his peer group in school or at work. At the end of the day, if you're a Spider-Man or comic book fan, you should probably go ahead and watch this for, if anything else, to appreciate and learn just how far along we've come with live-action comic book adaptations.
Well, I guess this lets you off the hook.
But not Spider-Man.
That's right, Peter. I'm you, and you're me, and this is a gun.